podcast. We're really excited to see new faces, many new faces. Tom and I started this group 3 years ago, and Katie was at the first meetup when about 200 people showed up. And that's how it all started, and it's so good to see the journey since then. Over the last couple of years, I've been focusing a lot more on using AI and applying it to social impact-related challenges, such as some aspects of climate change, sexual abuse, and the work we're doing on domestic violence and mental health. Katie and I used to work together, and then she's one of the best writers I've ever worked with. And when we started to look at the issue of domestic violence, I thought, I'm a technologist and a product person, not necessarily somebody who's good with words, and so therefore
Kriti tends to say I take the stuff that's in her brain and translate it so normal people can understand it. So yeah. I'll be doing it today.
And we'll share with you in a very transparent way how the journey of our product rAInbow started. And it is a very dark topic, so bear with me, but it's an incredible product which came out of a very strange collaboration. I used to live in South Africa, in Johannesburg, for some time, and during that period, one of the issues I noticed in South Africa was that there was a very high rate of domestic violence. And I did not know very much about this topic. I grew up in India, where there are various forms of violence, but I personally always felt very safe at home. And when I started to talk to women in South Africa, they were sharing their issues and how unsafe they felt in their own homes. And we realized, when we dug deeper into these statistics, that 1 in 3 women in the world face violence. And this violence can be in the form of sexual abuse, psychological, financial, emotional, and this happens in their own homes. In South Africa, it has the highest rate of femicide, which is the murder of a woman from her own partner in her own home. And it's highest by a long margin. It's 5 times higher than anywhere else in the world. And so we thought, how could we help? And what are the underlying causes behind this very high rate of violence and extreme underreporting? Less than 1% of the cases ever get reported to the police. And we talked, I personally went and spoke to over 100 women who had been through abuse and tried to understand the patterns. And this was even before we thought of a bot or AI or any other tool. And there were 3 key patterns that emerged. First one that was preventing them from reporting violence was they didn't even know it was violence when they were going through that experience. They just thought things like, oh, my partner is too controlling, or shows affection in different ways. There was also a challenge with loneliness. Abuse is a very isolating experience. You might not even want to tell your closest friends and family. And secondly, we saw there was a lot of judgment, shame, and stigma. When they even decide to tell their closest friends or family, culturally, it's not really accepted to leave the relationship. And quite often the victim is blamed. So people would say, what did you do wrong to provoke this behavior? What did you do to make him do those things? And lastly, the government and various organizations have tried a lot of interventions. And one of the things that have kind of succeeded is a helpline where you could call and ask for help, and this is more after the fact. What is interesting is this helpline works Monday and Friday, 9 a.m. to 5 p.m., when abuse happens on the weekends and in the evenings the most. Also, you have to pick up the phone and talk to someone about a topic that you're yourself not very sure about, and more often than not, you're living in your house with the perpetrator. So looking at all of these design patterns, we thought we could build a digital tool and design it with a lot of specific nuances and challenges. A lot of these users don't necessarily think that they're going through abuse. Even if you do Google domestic violence, the first result that comes up in South Africa is the Domestic Violence Act of 1998, which is a 25-page document. And that's not how humans think. So we started to design a conversational experience and design it. And Katie did all the awesome design work and making it look like a companion and making it open, not necessarily about domestic violence. Even the naming, we decided to call it something quite hidden. It doesn't scream, this is a domestic violence service. It very much talks about it as, hi, I'm rAInbow, you can call me Bo, to make it easier to open up and invite the user to speak with them. And then says things like, you can talk to me about relationships that don't feel right, to really open up the conversations on this topic. And Katie will then take you through some of the design process we went through. But before we do that, I want to talk about who is in the team. So in addition to the technology and the design people, we partnered with an amazing human rights, civil rights organization called Soul City, who are a social justice institute. They've been working in this field for 40 years, and they really know how to communicate with people on this very difficult topic. And we partnered with Justina Michelle, who is Nelson Mandela's stepdaughter, and unfortunately faced domestic violence herself. And she really helped us bring this topic and raise awareness of rAInbow in the right way, because I don't think it would be very legit if I go and talk about domestic violence as an issue. But it's always good to partner with the right people.
Yeah, so Kriti's kind of talked you guys through the problem, and my job as a writer, she calls it design, but I guess I see myself more as a writer, it's the same thing really, but is to think, based on that problem, how can we use language and make this conversation work for these people, based on what we know about the people we're here to help. How can we write stuff and create a persona that they will find easiest and most comfortable to interact with. So when I kind of first got on board with rAInbow, with Bo, what we had was kind of a quite rudimentary flowchart. Kriti and people across the team had done a fair bit of work on the different paths the conversation might go down. So that's always where it starts, right? What are the different paths this conversation needs to take? And the next step for me is to think about what's the voice, what's the persona of this bot, what does it need to be like? And I think for those of you who've created a chatbot or worked on voice or are thinking about creating a bot and thinking about what tone of voice that needs to have, firstly, your bot does have a tone of voice. Whether you know it or not, it has one. Whatever words you are using to interact with your user are conveying something to them about who you are, about what this brand personality is. So if it's something you never thought about, it needs to be something you think about because it's coming across to your user, whether you know it or not, or like it or not. With a typical kind of assistant style bot, where your role is purely to kind of help and assist, maybe a customer service bot, that's a kind of quite different role to Bo. So the challenge is quite unique in thinking about the tone of voice because rAInbow's role in the user's life isn't just to provide assistance and help, but as Kriti said, kind of to be a companion. There's this idea that being in these relationships is incredibly isolating, as Kriti said, is really, really lonely. And what we got a sense of from these women is not just that they wanted someone to get information, but that they wanted that to feel kind of like a friend. So in terms of coming up with the persona, there are a few things that came into that. One was kind of simplicity of language, and language being super conversational. We talk a lot at The Writer, for example, about writing like you speak, and how it's important to communicate with your reader on a level that, in language that they understand and would take in, rather than your own language and jargon and kind of internal things. And what we found about our kind of typical, the people who'd be our users through kind of focus groups and testing and things like that, is that they'd have really mixed literacy levels, but some of those literacy levels would be really, really low. So it was really important that the language we used was pretty simple, pretty straightforward. So that's where we're starting from. Also, we're thinking, what is the relationship in terms of kind of status? It's so important that Bo didn't feel like it was up here and the user's down here. I'm talking to you from on high, I'm judging you, I'm telling you things about how things are. I had to feel very kind of, we're on the same level here. And judgment is a huge thing that came into creating this personality as well. The reason a lot of these women aren't talking to their friends and family about things is for fear of judgment, of how they'll be seen. Of, well, what are you doing? What are the actions you're taking? Is it because of your behaviour rather than his? And particularly from the women we spoke to in South Africa, I know we found that there's sometimes a tendency to think you should stay in the marriage, no matter what's happening. So it was really important that judgment was not present at all in Bo's tone, that it's almost like your friend who is super tolerant, super non-judgmental. You could say anything to this friend, you could tell it that you killed someone, and they'd be like, okay, here's what we're going to do, here's how we're going to deal with this. So that was the kind of persona I needed to take. But also along with that, to be pretty direct, because it was important that when we're talking about what isn't healthy in a relationship, we're being very clear and unambiguous that certain things are absolutely not okay. And we're then pointing people to certain resources, so we couldn't sort of pussyfoot around things or use quite kind of hedgy language or go, oh, maybe you want to talk about to someone about that. It had to be very, this is not okay. It's important you know this is not okay. So that was an interesting thing to think about as well. And then there was how we actually approach the topic of domestic violence itself in language. Because Kriti touched on this, but if we had started it by being like, hey, I'm a domestic violence bot, one, that is a massive issue in terms of security and me feeling comfortable talking to you about this. My partner very likely looks at my phone if I'm in an abusive relationship, so he can't see that I'm talking to something like this. But also, a lot of the people we're speaking to might not even be are very likely not thinking about what's happening to them as domestic violence. So if they see this label of domestic violence, they're like, oh, it doesn't apply to me. They don't hit me. They don't physically abuse me, so that doesn't apply to me. Or even if they do hit me, it's only when they're drunk. That's not something that applies to me. So it was really interesting for us to kind of figure out the nuances of the language we use to talk about this. And a lot of the language we came up with is the kind of thing you can see on the screen here. I'm here to talk about relationships that don't feel right. Or I'm here to talk about what is and isn't healthy in a relationship. Or what is and isn't okay in a relationship. That language felt very okay and very sort of accessible. It was important to us that we started with something that felt super interactive. And I hate to say fun, but it's almost like when we kind of were talking to the women, they wanted this to be a really kind of friendly, positive experience. They liked Bo, this personality that we created. They wanted to interact with it on a level that was almost like a friendship, not a purely kind of service level, not purely kind of just you helping me, but a certain friendship. So we started it with a kind of quiz that's, how much do you think you know about what is and isn't okay in a relationship? Well, let's see. And you give it a few scenarios, you give the user a few scenarios, and they can say, I think that's healthy, or oh, I'm not sure. And Bo will tell you whether or not Bo thinks you're right. Then there's other content you can access. There are different, Bo can tell you about different signs. We can maybe have a little look. So this is a part of Bo that's talking about different signs of that a relationship might be abusive. So whether that's physical or sexual abuse. Also lesser known types of abuse, financial abuse, emotional abuse, really important that we talked about those as well. But the other big part of the content in Bo were the stories. Because if the people from the writer here will know that stories are incredibly powerful to form an emotional connection with us, almost more so than just kind of giving out facts. So the people we worked with at Soul City created these kind of fictional stories about fictional women, but based on women they actually knew and people that had come to them and they'd seen in shelters and things like that. Making sure to represent different demographics, different ethnicities, different ages, and social demographics within our sort of the people who might use us. And what I got as a writer was kind of these really long stories, about 2 pages long. And I'm like, okay, how do I turn that into something that can be done on a chatbot? Because you're not going to sit there and scroll through like pages and pages of writing, because that's not how conversation works. And obviously it's really important that your bot follows kind of typical rules, etiquette of conversation. So what we did is we kind of made the story sort of interactive. So you could say, hey, I want to hear this person's story. And then she would start telling her story, and you could ask her questions as you went along. So almost like a sort of choose your own adventure type story where you could figure out details about the story as you went. So that's how we got around that.
I just wanted to add in the stories that for many of our users, they don't have role models who have taken action, kind of accepted the way things are. And for that, and the stories weren't as dramatic as, in the end, everything was fine and this person had a wonderful life and lived happily ever after. They were very realistically designed, real life examples. And when we did testing, and even now the data we measure, it's the most popular feature in the entire experience by far. And it leads to a very high call to action rate. So at the end of these stories are usually signs to signpost them to services where they can get help, and that's where we see the most action, where we see someone else going through a journey and take control, or get rooted and get help, and that prompts them to take action themselves.
Yeah, because again, I guess even if we're listing things about signs of that you might be in an abusive relationship, you might still see that and feel quite detached from it, whereas if you see something kind of channeled through the funnel of a story, there's a certain indirectness that allows you to connect with it a bit more on an emotional level, and then think, okay, actually that was really like what happened to me. Or important to say as well, rAInbow isn't just for survivors or victims themselves, but also for family and friends who maybe want to have someone in their lives they're worried about, and want to think, how can I help them? So it points you to all sorts of resources as to how you can help someone you might know who's going through something.
Yeah, and with regards to friends, we often see users saying they're asking for help for a friend, even if they're talking to a machine, and then halfway through the conversation, they start talking like, this is what happened to me, and this is how I felt, which made it easier for them to take that first step by allowing them to ask for help from friends.
So I guess then the next thing was the kind of testing and seeing what people thought about this, and getting the sort of impact and how people used it. So we found, as I said, people were super positive about the tone of voice, and if anything, wanted it to be more friendly and more, said they just like couldn't get enough. They just wanted to keep engaging with it, and not on a pure sort of informational exchange level, but in terms of, as I said, almost like a companion, like a friend. So we almost had to dial up the sort of friendly elements or even fun elements in places. There were some interesting challenges, like we couldn't use stuff that was too media rich, like media heavy, which is really, really interesting because in South Africa, or maybe it's just as part of South Africa, we were particularly looking at data is really, really expensive.
Oh, it's everywhere.
Okay, everywhere, there you go. You know, she's South African. Data is really, really expensive, but it's more expensive during the day and it's cheaper at night. So most of the women that we were speaking to were using their phones at night, and especially for a use case like this, where it's something where you have to be covert because it's happening in your family. So that meant, for example, that we weren't doing things like playing videos and GIFs, or kind of using images. You saw a couple of carousel menus with kind of graphics, but no kind of photo images and videos and stuff that would be too kind of media heavy, because it takes up too much data and that's too expensive. So really kind of understanding the challenges that were specific to this use case.
We had a spike in user volumes and engagement from midnight to 4 a.m. It's quite interesting. It's when a lot of the users are online. And Katie did a very phenomenal job with one particular thing, which is the color tone of the emojis.
Oh yeah, this was really interesting because I was very conscious that I was working on this as a white person, and that in South Africa it was important that our users might be people of all ethnicities, and not to assume that people of certain skin tones would be using Bow more. But so there's an interesting thing with emojis, that white people are more likely to use the default yellow emojis, whereas people who aren't white are more likely to use the emoji that most closely matches their skin tone. It's a really interesting thing. People think it might be to do with like white guilt or something like that. So there was a thing where I had used kind of naturally the yellow kind of default emojis the whole time, and then I was like, oh shit, should I be doing this? Should I be using kind of different ethnicities? So what we decided on in the end, because we didn't want to make assumptions about the ethnicity or race of our user, is that we use the default yellow ones for things like waving or kind of hand signs and stuff like that. But where we had the women's stories, because when a character, one of the women who's a character in the bot is telling you her story, she has a name that, again, I didn't make up these names, we got them from people at Soul City and made sure we chose kind of a range of women's names in South Africa. They would have their own kind of emoji that would have, so one woman had a darker skin tone, one had maybe different kind of colours of skin tone, to make sure we were showing that we were representing different women's stories. But yeah, that was an interesting thing. I didn't know I'd have to think about colour tones of emojis, and it's important.
Yeah, and throughout the journey, we got getting feedback was quite an interesting experience. And this does not have very much to do with bots, but with humans and collaboration. We were working with partners in a sector where things move very slowly, and we were giving them data to improve the machine learning component, to improve the intelligence of the bot once a week, and which was quite slow for us, and for them it was very, very fast. And so creating a methodology and language to collaborate and co-create with people who are from a completely different world was a challenge, and also couldn't give them difficult or complicated scripting tools. And so Katie, you used just a simple Word doc.
Yeah, so anyone who's kind of done the kind of scripting or actual writing of a chatbot will know, but there are all kinds of tools you can use. When I started working on Bow, they were using Poplet. I don't know if anyone here has used that. It's just a kind of flowchart on mind mapping software. And that is one of the easiest things you can write. You can write a bot on. Is flowchart or mind map software. You absolutely don't have to know how to code or develop it yourself, because I don't know how to do it. So things like Twinery are good to use and stuff like that. in terms of seeing how the different conversational paths map out. So what I did is almost start on popular in terms of thinking about how the different paths would go, more sort of conversation design element. But when it came to the actual scripting, I just used Word because I'm a writer and I come at things, it's a dialogue, right? It's a conversation. So I was almost thinking about it like being a playwright, where you want to see Bo says this, user could say this, this, or this, Bo says this. And that just helped me visualize the conversation much more than having it on a kind of mind map or flowchart.
And we tried to train the model and to make it a lot more intelligent pre-launch. We tried to do all kinds of things, like collect data sets from social media, from Twitter, various banks, to see how people talk about this issue. And it was a very difficult job, because the way people speak about it on social media, or the way activists or famous celebrities speak about domestic violence in social media, it's very different to survivors or abusive, people in abusive relationships talk about it themselves. So the data process to train the models almost started from scratch to a large extent. But we were very, very lucky that we got huge uptake very quickly. And so a big task was to make the bot smarter constantly by understanding how people speak. And it was very different for various communities within South Africa. One of the biggest challenges we have at the moment, where a lot of the AI is happening, is language-related errors, or the way people spell it. It's very text speak, i.e.txt speak. And even humans can sometimes find it hard to understand. That's why we're spending a lot of effort, because as most of you know here who build bots, to build a bad bot is very easy, but to build a good bot, it takes a lot of effort, and that's where most of our effort is going in now. And the other thing we noticed is once the user started to understand what Bo was and knew that it wasn't human, it was a machine, and we make it very clear right in the beginning, they started to trust it, and over time shared their own deep personal stories about this is what happened to me, and this was the whole scenario, which raised a lot of interesting challenges. Firstly, the duty of care. So that somebody's saying and giving this information to the machine, it's our responsibility to hand them off to the right person. But over time, we started to see the complexities of each case. It's not as simple as I'm facing physical domestic violence and therefore I must go to this shelter, or I think my friend is facing emotional abuse and I should do X. In many cases, it was extremely complex with various factors involved, like HIV-related abuse, impact on young children, alcohol, substance abuse, oftentimes many of these in the same case, or issues related to reverse dowry practices in certain communities and tribes. So now, from a natural language processing perspective, we're tagging and creating models to understand a lot of these complex issues and find out what's the right response and recommendation and signposting. The other challenge we found, so we built a partnership with amazing organizations who are willing to take our users on the next steps. The point of rAInbow is to raise awareness of these topics, help people understand what's normal and what's not normal, and the next step is to then take action if they want to. And we had this huge list of partners who wanted to collaborate, but then we started to do a lot of quality checks, because even though these might be famous organizations, if users are used to this real-time response and they're sharing their stories and then they get transferred to a partner network, which then will call back or get back to them in 3 days, it doesn't quite work. So we need to start building and bringing our network with us. We also saw a lot of drop-offs. And when they get very comfortable with this chat mechanism, they don't want to pick up the phone and speak to a human advisor. They just want to continue talking and chatting and getting handed off to a human. So it's all about also managing expectations after they've had this better experience than what they have today. Another quick point I wanted to mention was the marketing and advertising, how we targeted users. We got some support from Facebook for this project, and so they helped us target the right users on Instagram and FB, but it didn't say, here's an ad, talk to rAInbow, manage your money, or deal with domestic violence. It was more about, we used some of the examples from the hundreds of stories of women who we spoke with and the data that was coming in through the system to use the way people speak in the adverts. So it would be things like, you'll see a message that says, I slipped in the shower, it was no big deal. And this is very often how victims or people going through domestic violence talk. So they will see tones and messages that they have in their mind, or that's how they describe their situation, not as this is domestic violence. Just a quick note. Are we running out of time? Yes.
Should we talk about impact?
Yes, okay. Some information on impact. So far, we launched about 7 months ago, and so far we have about 300,000 conversations, which is pretty high in South Africa on a topic like this, quite a lot by that scale, given that it's hugely underreported as an issue. We also have a high repeat rate, so people do come back when they want more information. We do have dropouts, so that's quite often people will discover and start sharing, my partner cheated on me, or I think I need some life advice. There's also a lot of drop off in helping people take them from a very wide approach. Let's talk about relationships, to be more narrow, but the ones who stay with stick for a long time. In terms of wider impact in the world of applying AI to solving social problems, we just 2 months ago received UNESCO Digital Innovation of the Year Award, which was very exciting. It was given to the top 10 innovations from about 2,000 of innovations in the world. And the point is really to start thinking about how we can apply some simple technologies, which for many of these organizations sounds like science fiction. And this is things that we've been doing for 3, 5, 10 years, but for these organizations, this is game-changing. And that's what I would like you guys to think about in the tools and knowledge you have, how this could be applied to some of the problems that we don't obviously talk about in public. Thank you.
Thank you.